Love rarely begins with certainty. It begins quietly, almost unnoticed, in moments that seem small at the time but grow heavier with meaning as the years pass. 50 years ago, before wrinkles and gray hair, before responsibilities and regrets, there were simply two young people standing at the edge of their lives, unaware that one simple meeting would become the foundation of everything that followed. They did not know they were about to share decades of mornings and nights, laughter and tears, gain and loss. They only knew the feeling, an unfamiliar pull, a sense of comfort mixed with curiosity, a connection that felt natural without needing explanation. Back then, love felt light. It lived in shy glances held a second too long, in nervous smiles, in conversations that stretched endlessly because neither wanted to be the first to walk away. The world around them moved fast, but when they were together, time seemed to slow, as if giving them permission to dream. In those early days, everything felt possible. They talked about the future with excitement, not fear. Dreams were big, even if resources were small. Love didn't require grand gestures, it thrived on presence. A walk together meant more than a gift, and shared silence felt richer than empty words. They learned each other in fragments, favorite songs, small habits, the way one laughed too loudly or grew quiet when worried. They were still becoming themselves, yet somehow they were already becoming us. What they didn't realize was that love at the beginning is not tested by hardship but protected by innocence. It is easy to promise forever when forever feels far away. Marriage, commitment, choosing one another, these were decisions made with hope, not full understanding. They stepped into life together carrying excitement and fear in equal measure. The early years were not perfect, no matter how memory might soften them now. Money was often tight, patience was thinner than they wanted to admit, and misunderstandings arrived uninvited. Arguments began over small things and sometimes grew into heavy silence. There were moments when pride spoke louder than love, when words were said that could not be taken back. Yet even then, something stronger than anger kept them from walking away. Apologies came slowly, sometimes awkwardly, but they came. Forgiveness was learned, not mastered. Love was no longer just a feeling, it was becoming a choice. Life did not wait for them to figure things out. Responsibilities piled up quickly. Days grew longer, nights shorter. Work demanded energy, and exhaustion crept into places where excitement once lived. Dreams adjusted themselves to reality, sometimes shrinking, sometimes changing shape entirely. There were moments of disappointment when life did not unfold as imagined, when effort did not immediately lead to reward. In those moments, love was tested not by dramatic events but by daily persistence. Showing up, continuing, choosing patience over escape, they learned that love was not sustained by constant happiness but by commitment during ordinary, difficult days. There were also moments of joy that stitched the years together, shared laughter over something only they understood, victories that felt bigger because they were celebrated together, quiet nights where the world felt distant and safe. These moments didn't erase the struggles, but they made them worth enduring. Slowly, without realizing it, they were building a shared history, layer by layer. Memories accumulated not in grand milestones alone, but in repeated routines, the same chair at the table, the same side of the bed, the same familiar presence at the end of a long day. Youth faded gradually, almost politely. They did not wake up one morning feeling old, they simply noticed that time was moving faster than before. Faces matured, priorities shifted, and expectations softened. Love changed too. It became less about excitement and more about reliability. Less about impressing and more about understanding. They learned how to argue without destroying, how to disagree without disrespecting. They discovered that love did not require winning, it required listening. Some lessons came easily, others were learned the hard way, but each one left them stronger than before. Looking back now, the beginning feels fragile and powerful all at once. Fragile because it could have been broken so easily by impatience or fear. Powerful because it survived. What started as a feeling slowly transformed into a foundation. They did not stay together because life was kind, but because they chose kindness within life's challenges. Love, in its earliest form, was not about knowing everything, it was about believing enough to begin. And that belief, simple and imperfect, carried them forward into decades they could never have imagined, planting the first quiet promise that this journey, however difficult, would be shared. Time has a way of speeding up once love settles into routine. The days that once felt endless now passed quietly, measured not in dreams but in responsibilities. Life grew fuller and heavier at the same time. Mornings began earlier, nights ended later, and rest became something postponed for another day. Love was no longer the center of every thought, not because it mattered less, but because everything else demanded space beside it. Work, family, obligations, expectations, each claimed a portion of their energy. And yet, love remained there, steady and waiting, even when it was pushed into the background. This was the season where love stopped being admired and started being relied upon. The middle years were not gentle. They arrived with pressure and persistence, asking more than either had expected to give. There were children to raise, mouths to feed, futures to secure. Dreams that once belonged to two people now had to stretch wide enough to include others. Sacrifice became routine, sleep was shortened, patience was tested, and worry became a constant companion. Some days felt like survival rather than living. In those moments, love did not look romantic. It looked tired. It looked like doing what needed to be done even when appreciation was absent. It looked like carrying weight together, even when neither felt strong enough alone. Arguments changed during these years. They were no longer about small misunderstandings but about exhaustion, money, fear, and unspoken expectations. Words carried sharper edges when spoken in frustration. Silence sometimes lasted longer than intended. There were nights when backs turned away from each other, when distance filled the space between two people who loved deeply but were stretched thin. Doubt crept in quietly, whispering questions neither wanted to voice. Is this what love becomes? Is this all there is? Yet even in doubt, there was something that refused to let go. A shared history too meaningful to abandon. A sense of responsibility not only to each other but to the life they had built together. Mistakes were made. Both stumbled in different ways. There were moments of selfishness, moments of misunderstanding, moments when one felt unseen or unheard. Forgiveness was no longer theoretical, it became necessary. Sometimes forgiveness came quickly, offered freely. Other times it arrived slowly, after pain had been felt and acknowledged. Apologies were not always perfect, but they were sincere. Love matured through these imperfect repairs. It learned that staying meant facing discomfort rather than escaping it. That healing required honesty, not denial. That commitment was proven not by never failing, but by returning, again and again, after failure. There were seasons when one carried more than the other. Illness, stress, disappointment, life never distributed its burdens evenly. Love adjusted itself accordingly. When one grew weary, the other stood stronger. When one faltered, the other steadied them. This balance shifted over time, never fixed, always responding to what was needed. In these years, love became deeply practical. It showed itself in small, consistent acts rather than grand declarations. A prepared meal, a quiet check-in, a hand placed gently on a shoulder after a long day. These gestures were rarely noticed by the outside world, but they became the language through which love continued to speak. Loss also found its way into their story. People they loved slipped away, leaving absences that could not be filled. Grief entered their homes softly and stayed longer than expected. In grief, love learned stillness. There were no words that could solve the ache, only presence. Sitting together in silence, sharing memories, allowing tears without judgment. In those moments, love was not about fixing pain but about enduring it side by side. It learned that strength did not always mean optimism, sometimes it meant simply staying when leaving would have been easier. As years layered themselves one upon another, familiarity deepened. They knew each other's habits so well that words became unnecessary. They sensed moods before they were spoken. They recognized the signs of stress, sadness, joy, and relief without explanation. This closeness was comforting, but it also required care. Familiarity could breed neglect if left unchecked. Love demanded intentional effort even when everything felt known. They learned that choosing each other was not a one-time promise but a daily decision, renewed quietly through actions rather than words. There were moments of reflection during these years, often late at night when the house was finally quiet. Moments when one wondered how life might have looked if different choices had been made. These thoughts were not regrets, but acknowledgments of paths not taken. Love did not eliminate curiosity about alternate lives, it simply anchored them to the one they had chosen. In recognizing what could have been, they better understood the value of what was. A shared life, imperfect yet deeply meaningful, shaped by resilience rather than fantasy. Slowly, almost unnoticed, the storms began to calm. The urgency that once defined every day softened. The weight of constant responsibility eased, replaced by a gentler rhythm. The love that survived these years emerged quieter but stronger, less fragile, less dependent on circumstances. It had been tested by time, stress, loss, and doubt, and it remained. Not unchanged, but refined. The middle years carved depth into their bond, transforming love from a feeling into a partnership, from passion into trust, from promise into proof. What remained was not the love of youth, but something steadier, wiser, and far more enduring. The years did not announce their arrival. They came softly, marked by subtle changes rather than sudden shifts. Strength faded gradually, replaced by caution. Movements slowed, routines became sacred, and time seemed to stretch in quieter ways. What once felt urgent now felt optional. What once demanded attention now invited reflection. Growing older together was not about resisting change, but learning how to move with it. Love adjusted itself again, this time with gentleness. The fire of youth had long softened, but in its place stood warmth, steady, familiar, and deeply comforting. Their days became simpler, though no less meaningful. Mornings began with shared rituals that needed no discussion. A glance, a nod, a silent understanding. They no longer spoke to fill space, silence itself had become a companion. There was peace in knowing that presence was enough. Love no longer needed reassurance through words. It lived in habit, in consistency, in the quiet certainty that neither was facing the world alone. They had grown into each other so completely that separation felt unimaginable, not because of dependence, but because of shared identity. Aging brought its own challenges. Bodies betrayed them in small, frustrating ways. Memory faltered, energy waned, and vulnerability became unavoidable. Tasks once done effortlessly now required patience. And yet, love did not shrink in the face of these changes. It expanded. Care replaced independence. Attention replaced ambition. One watched over the other with quiet devotion, noticing discomfort before it was spoken, adjusting the world gently to make things easier. Love became protective, attentive, and deeply human. It no longer asked, "What do we want?" but, "What do you need?" Roles shifted naturally. At times, one became the caretaker, the other the one needing care. These roles changed over time, never fixed, always understood without resentment. There was dignity in being cared for and honor in providing care. Love was no longer about equality in effort, but equity in compassion. Each gave what they could, when they could. There was no scorekeeping, only presence. In these moments, love revealed one of its deepest truths, that devotion is not proven by grand sacrifice, but by patience in the ordinary moments of need. Memories began to feel heavier, richer. Stories were told and retold, not because they were forgotten, but because they mattered. Laughter followed familiar moments, and sometimes tears did too. The past lived vividly between them, a shared landscape filled with triumphs and mistakes, joys and losses. They had survived enough together to know that nothing truly meaningful was ever wasted. Even pain had shaped them, softened them, taught them how to hold each other with care. Love had become a witness to their entire lives, holding every version of who they had been. The world outside continued to change rapidly, often in ways they barely recognized. Technology advanced, values shifted, and time felt louder than it used to be. But within their shared space, there was calm. Love created a refuge where speed was unnecessary. They found joy in watching the light change through a window, in sitting together without destination, in conversations that wandered gently through memory and reflection. The need to prove anything had disappeared. They were enough, just as they were. Fear arrived occasionally, as it always does when time feels finite. Fear of loss, of illness, of one day waking up without the other. These fears were rarely spoken aloud, but they were understood. Love did not eliminate fear, it made it bearable. Holding hands a little tighter, lingering a little longer, savoring moments that once would have passed unnoticed. Love became an act of presence, fully inhabiting the now, because the now was all that was promised. As they aged, love grew quieter, but never weaker. It stopped demanding attention and began offering peace. It became the steady rhythm beneath every day, the assurance that even as the body weakened, the bond remained unshaken. Growing old together was not about clinging to the past or fearing the future. It was about honoring the present, about recognizing that the greatest achievement was not longevity itself, but the grace with which they had traveled time side by side. By the time 50 years had passed, love no longer needed explanation. It existed without effort, without performance, without the need to be seen. It lived in the smallest moments, in the pauses between words, in the way one still reached for the other instinctively. Time had taken much from them, youth, strength, certainty, but it had also given them something rare, the privilege of a shared lifetime. Looking back, they did not see a perfect story. They saw a real one. A story shaped by patience, endurance, forgiveness, and choice. Reflection came easily now. Sitting together, they revisited the past not with regret, but with understanding. The mistakes no longer carried shame, they carried lessons. The struggles no longer felt heavy, they felt meaningful. Every hardship had carved depth into their bond, teaching them how to love more fully, more gently. They realized that love was never about avoiding pain, but about deciding who was worth enduring it with. And for 50 years, they had answered that question the same way. Wisdom had grown quietly alongside them. They learned that love does not survive on feelings alone. Feelings fade, shift, and return, but commitment remains. Love, they discovered, is built in moments of restraint, in choosing kindness when anger feels easier, in listening when being right feels tempting. It is built in the decision to stay when leaving seems simpler, and in the humility to apologize even when pride resists. These were not lessons learned once, but practiced daily, over decades. What surprised them most was how love had softened them. Time had stripped away urgency, ego, and fear of vulnerability. They no longer needed to protect themselves from each other. Every flaw was known, every strength recognized. There was freedom in being fully seen and still fully loved. Love had become a place of rest, not excitement, a place where they could be exactly who they were without apology. As the days grew quieter, gratitude filled the space where ambition once lived. Gratitude for shared mornings, for surviving difficult seasons, for laughter that still arrived unexpectedly. Gratitude for a partner who had witnessed every chapter of life and chosen to remain. They understood now that longevity in love was not a guarantee, but a gift, one earned through persistence and grace. When they looked at each other, they no longer saw age. They saw history. They saw the young faces that once dreamed without knowing, the middle years shaped by effort and sacrifice, the present defined by tenderness and presence. Love had traveled with them through every version of themselves, adapting, enduring, and remaining faithful. It was no longer something they did, it was something they were. And in the end, love did not ask for recognition. It asked only to be lived. 50 years of choosing, forgiving, staying, and believing had transformed two lives into one shared story. Not a story of perfection, but of persistence. Not a story of constant happiness, but of constant commitment. This was what love became after 50 years, not loud, not dramatic, not idealized, but steady, honest, and profoundly human. And in that quiet truth, they found everything they had ever been searching for.